In the tapestry of English history, certain figures stand out not merely for their political maneuverings or their royal blood, but for the legacies they left in institutions that would outlive their own generations. Margaret Beaufort, the Countess of Richmond and Derby, is one such figure. To speak of Margaret Beaufort is to conjure the image of a pious noblewoman, a matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, and above all, a visionary patron of education. While her son, Henry VII, may have secured the throne after the long and bloody Wars of the Roses, it was Margaret who helped ensure that the intellectual and spiritual life of England would have a firm foundation in the centuries to come. At first glance, Margaret's story appears to follow the familiar pattern of medieval noblewomen: early marriage, childbearing, political alliances. Yet beneath these conventions lay a fierce intelligence and an unwavering sense of purpose. Unlike many women of her station, she did not fade into the background once her son became king. Instead, she carved out an enduring role as a benefactor of learning and faith. Today, her name is indelibly linked with Cambridge University, with colleges and religious institutions that still bear witness to her vision. But why Margaret Beaufort? Why should we, in the 21st century, concern ourselves with the story of a woman born in 1443 whose life was intertwined with the turbulence of late medieval England? The answer lies not only in the dynastic significance of her being the mother of the first Tudor king, but also in the cultural and educational institutions she safeguarded. Her story is one of resilience, devotion, and foresight, a rare combination of personal piety and public service that positioned her as a model of female patronage in an era when women's roles were narrowly defined. To understand Margaret's contribution, we must first situate her within her time. The 15th century was an age of conflict and transition. England was torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. Religion, too, was undergoing quiet but powerful shifts. The seeds of reform were being sown, even as the medieval church still dominated intellectual and spiritual life. Education, meanwhile, was largely the preserve of clerics and the nobility. Universities like Oxford and Cambridge were not yet the global centers of knowledge they would later become, but they were vital crucibles of learning, producing clergy, administrators, and scholars. It is into this world that Margaret Beaufort was born. From an early age, she was deeply marked by the intersections of power, faith, and duty. Married at 12, widowed soon after, and a mother by 13, Margaret's life was never free of hardship. Yet these very hardships seemed to fortify her character rather than diminish it. In her later years, when her son had secured the throne and she could finally exercise influence without fear of reprisal, she turned her energies toward a cause that would shape the intellectual life of England: the advancement of education. Her motivations were deeply spiritual. Margaret's faith was no superficial matter of ritual. It was a guiding force in her life. She immersed herself in prayer, confession, and charitable works. To her, education was not merely a practical tool for governance or social advancement. It was a sacred duty, a means of glorifying God and cultivating wisdom. In supporting the universities, she was not only endowing institutions of learning, but also ensuring that future generations of clergy and scholars would uphold the spiritual and intellectual fabric of the nation. One cannot fully grasp the magnitude of her contributions without understanding the precarious state of universities at the time. Cambridge, in particular, was vulnerable. Its colleges were modest in scale and finances, its future uncertain amid political and social upheavals. Into this environment, Margaret stepped as a benefactor, channeling her wealth and influence to create stability and opportunity. Her role was not passive. She engaged actively with the institutions she supported, laying down statutes, shaping curricula, and ensuring that her endowments were secured. The legacy of Margaret Beaufort is thus twofold. She was both a mother of kings and a mother of scholars. The Tudor dynasty, which she helped bring to power, would dominate English history for more than a century. But her educational legacy transcends dynasties. Long after the Tudors were gone, the colleges she founded, the scholarships she endowed, and the structure she supported continued to nurture minds that would shape England's intellectual and spiritual life. In exploring her legacy, we will move beyond the dates and titles to uncover the story of a woman who wielded influence in subtle but profound ways. We will trace her journey from her early life and marriages through the tumult of civil war to her eventual role as one of the most important female patrons of learning in English history. We will examine her foundations at Cambridge, her religious commitments, and the ways in which she used her resources to strengthen institutions that remain central to English cultural life. This is not simply a story of stone buildings and endowed chairs. It is the story of vision and foresight, of a woman who understood that power and wealth could serve a higher purpose. In an age when female agency was limited, Margaret Beaufort created a legacy that has endured for over 500 years. Her life offers a lens through which to view the intersection of gender, faith, and education in late medieval England. As we embark on this exploration, one question lingers. How did a woman who lived under the shadow of dynastic struggle manage to shape the intellectual destiny of a nation? The answer lies in her character, her convictions, and her unique position as both a mother and a patron. The chapters ahead will unravel this question, tracing the contours of a legacy that has outlasted the politics of her age. To understand Margaret Beaufort's enduring contributions to education and religion, one must first trace the roots of her extraordinary character back to her childhood and formative years. Born on May 31st, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, Margaret entered a world marked by dynastic uncertainty and simmering conflict. She was the only child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp. Her father, though of royal blood as a descendant of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, lived under the shadow of disgrace. His failed military campaign in France and subsequent suicide left his infant daughter vulnerable. Margaret was less than a year old when he died, leaving her as his heiress and the bearer of both the Beaufort name and its heavy legacy. From the very beginning, Margaret's position was precarious. As a wealthy heiress and a potential link to the Lancastrian royal line, she became a pawn in the shifting chessboard of noble alliances. King Henry VI, himself a deeply pious but politically weak monarch, took an interest in her guardianship. He declared Margaret to be under his wardship, a move that underscored her value as a dynastic asset. Yet this protection also meant that her life would never be entirely her own to direct. From childhood, she was destined to be at the center of England's political storms. Despite these uncertainties, Margaret's early years were shaped by two forces that would remain constant throughout her life: her faith and her education. Accounts from contemporaries describe her as unusually devout from a young age. Her tutors, likely clerics chosen under royal oversight, instilled in her not only the standard accomplishments expected of noble women, such as needlework and household management, but also a grounding in Latin, scripture, and the moral teachings of the Church. For a girl in 15th century England, this was remarkable. Margaret's education went beyond practical skills. It prepared her to engage with theological and intellectual discourse in a way few women of her age could. Her childhood was short-lived, however, as political necessity soon dictated her future. At the tender age of 12, she was married to John de la Pole, heir to the Duke of Suffolk. The marriage was annulled almost immediately, but the incident underscores the extent to which Margaret was viewed as a political prize. Shortly thereafter, she was married to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI. This union was far from a romantic match. It was a strategic arrangement designed to strengthen Lancastrian claims and alliances. For Margaret, it marked the beginning of a life of sacrifice and resilience. At 13, Margaret gave birth to her only child, Henry Tudor. The experience was harrowing. Edmund Tudor had died of plague months before, leaving his young bride a widow and a mother before she had even reached adulthood. The dangers of childbirth were compounded by her youth and physical frailty. Some historians believe the trauma of this early pregnancy left her unable to bear further children. Yet it also left her with a singular sense of purpose. Her life became devoted to the protection and advancement of her son, the boy who would eventually become Henry VII. That Margaret's early widowhood forced her into a life of self-reliance. While her subsequent marriages to Sir Henry Stafford and later to Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, provided her with protection and political leverage, they did not diminish her independence. Unlike many women of her time, Margaret maintained control of her estates and finances, often negotiating directly with her stewards and asserting her authority in legal matters. These formative experiences forged in her a rare combination of practicality and vision. She knew what it meant to navigate uncertainty, to balance loyalty and survival, and to use her position shrewdly in a volatile world. What stands out most from this period is how Margaret's hardships deepened rather than eroded her faith. The late medieval church provided her with both solace and a framework for action. She turned to devotional texts, prayer, and charity not merely as personal piety, but as guiding principles for her conduct. The writings of influential theologians, such as Thomas à Kempis, shaped her worldview, emphasizing humility, service, and the imitation of Christ. These values would later inform her approach to patronage, particularly in education, where she saw the cultivation of learning as a means of serving both God and society. In the context of 15th century England, Margaret's devotion to learning was unusual, but not unprecedented. Noble women occasionally supported religious houses or schools, but few took such an active role in shaping intellectual life. Margaret's early exposure to scholarship and theology, combined with her personal experiences of loss and survival, planted the seeds for what would become her life's greatest legacy. She came to view education not simply as a privilege of birth, but as a responsibility, a tool for building a more faithful, stable, and enlightened realm. Her formative years thus reveal the contours of a character that would later reshape institutions of learning. She was not a passive figure swept along by dynastic currents, but an active participant who found ways to assert agency even within the constraints of her era. Through her marriages, widowhood, and maternal devotion, Margaret cultivated a resilience and foresight that would serve her well once her son ascended the throne. She understood, perhaps more than most, the fragility of power and the need to build legacies that could endure beyond the turmoil of politics. It is here, in the crucible of her early life, that we see the foundation of Margaret Beaufort's later achievements. The young widow who turned to prayer and books for strength would, decades later, endow colleges and secure scholarships for generations of scholars. Her belief that education and piety were inseparable became the cornerstone of her patronage. What began as a personal solace became a public mission, one that would leave an indelible mark on English intellectual and spiritual history. Margaret Beaufort's early life had prepared her for resilience, but the middle decades of the 15th century tested her in ways that would shape not only her personal destiny, but also the fate of England itself. The period known as the Wars of the Roses, a bitter struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York, dominated her adult life. These dynastic wars were not simply contests for crowns. They were brutal conflicts that fractured families, destabilized the realm, and forced figures like Margaret into precarious positions. For Margaret, survival meant mastering the art of political maneuvering while remaining steadfast in her devotion to her son, Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian heir. The Wars of the Roses erupted from the weakness of King Henry VI, a monarch plagued by bouts of mental illness and incapable of exerting firm control over his nobility. As a descendant of the Beaufort line, legitimized but still often viewed with suspicion, Margaret held a complicated place in this conflict. On one hand, her bloodline tied her to the Lancastrian cause, giving her son a tenuous claim to the throne. On the other hand, the Yorkists held power for much of the conflict, making her allegiance to Lancaster dangerous. That Margaret's political role during these years cannot be overstated. She was not a warrior queen in the mold of Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's French consort, but she was a strategist whose quiet perseverance preserved the Lancastrian cause. Her priority was clear: to protect her son. When the Yorkists rose to dominance and Henry VI was deposed, Young Henry Tudor's life was placed in grave danger. Margaret, unable to shield him directly, had to rely on networks of allies and protectors, as well as her own resourcefulness, to ensure his survival. Following the Lancastrian defeat at Towton in 1461, the Yorkist Edward IV seized the throne. For Margaret, this was a turning point. Her son was sent into exile, first to Brittany and then to France, where he would spend much of his youth. Margaret herself was left in England, navigating a treacherous political landscape. Her marriage to Henry Stafford, a man of moderate loyalties, provided some protection, but also forced her to tread carefully between rival factions. She was a widow once more by 1471, after Stafford's death from wounds sustained in battle. The defining moment of Margaret's political life came with her fourth marriage to Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley. Stanley was a cautious and pragmatic nobleman, skilled in the art of survival under both Yorkist and Lancastrian regimes. While their marriage may have lacked romantic warmth, it provided Margaret with a measure of security and influence. Through Stanley, she gained access to the corridors of Yorkist power. Even as she quietly plotted her son's return, her political strategy during these years was remarkable for its subtlety. Unlike the overt militancy of other Lancastrian supporters, Margaret cultivated relationships on both sides of the conflict. She ingratiated herself with the Yorkist regime when necessary, even serving as godmother to one of Edward IV's daughters. Yet beneath this facade of loyalty, she worked tirelessly to advance her son's cause. She corresponded with exiled Lancastrians, maintained contact with Henry abroad, and forged clandestine alliances that would later prove decisive. When Richard III seized the throne in 1483, following the death of his brother Edward IV, the political landscape shifted once again. Richard's usurpation, coupled with the mysterious disappearance of the young princes in the Tower, created widespread unease. For Margaret, this presented both a danger and an opportunity. She saw in Richard's unpopularity the chance to rally support for her son. Her most important alliance during this period was with Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen of Edward IV. Together, the two women conspired to unite their houses through marriage. Henry Tudor would wed Elizabeth of York, thereby reconciling the warring factions. That Margaret's courage in these years should not be underestimated. Richard III was no fool. He recognized the threat posed by Henry Tudor and Margaret's maneuverings. In 1483, Parliament passed an act of attainder against her, stripping her of lands and titles. Yet Margaret survived thanks to the influence of her husband, Lord Stanley, who pleaded for her and ensured that she was placed under house arrest rather than imprisoned. Even in confinement, she continued to plot, communicating through trusted servants and agents. Her perseverance paid off in 1485. As Henry Tudor prepared to invade England and claim the throne, Margaret mobilized her networks of supporters. The climactic moment came at the Battle of Bosworth, where Lord Stanley and his brother William famously switched sides, lending crucial support to Henry. Richard III was killed on the battlefield, and Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII. For Margaret, the victory was not only a vindication of her long years of maneuvering, but also the fulfillment of her deepest hope. Her son, against all odds, was now King of England. In the aftermath of Bosworth, Margaret assumed a unique position. As the king's mother, she styled herself "My Lady the King's Mother," a title that underscored her authority while maintaining respect for her son's sovereignty. Unlike many dowager queens or noble widows, she did not retreat into obscurity. Instead, she embraced a quasi-royal role, advising her son, managing estates, and continuing to shape policy. Her survival through decades of civil war had sharpened her political instincts, but now her focus shifted. With her son secure on the throne, she could turn her energies toward the causes closest to her heart: education and religion. The Wars of the Roses had tested Margaret's resilience and honed her strategic skills. They had forced her to learn patience, subtlety, and the importance of building durable institutions. In this crucible of conflict, she discovered that power won on the battlefield was fleeting, but power invested in education and faith could endure for generations. The experiences of war had taught her the fragility of dynasties, and it was this understanding that spurred her to create legacies that would outlast the Tudors themselves. When Margaret Beaufort emerged from the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, her role as the mother of the new Tudor dynasty gave her unprecedented influence. Yet rather than revel in political triumph or material wealth, she turned her focus toward a deeper mission: the nurturing of faith and the strengthening of religious life in England. Her legacy in this realm is as profound as her contributions to education. For Margaret was one of the most significant female religious patrons of late medieval England. That Margaret's devotion was not the perfunctory piety expected of noble women. It was a profound and guiding force. From her youth, she had cultivated a deep sense of spirituality, rooted in the teachings of the Church and the writings of devotional thinkers such as Thomas à Kempis, whose imitation of Christ emphasized humility, self-discipline, and inner devotion. As she matured, her spiritual life became both more disciplined and more outwardly expressed. She adhered to a strict routine of prayer, confession, fasting, and almsgiving, and she surrounded herself with clerics and confessors who guided her spiritual journey. Chief among these was John Fisher, later Bishop of Rochester, who became both her chaplain and her confidant. Their relationship would profoundly influence the shape of her religious patronage. Her commitment to faith was not limited to personal practice. Margaret saw her position and resources as tools for advancing the Church's mission. She funded the construction and restoration of religious buildings, endowed clergy positions, and supported monastic houses. Her piety translated into tangible contributions that enriched England's spiritual landscape. Most notably, she played a crucial role in promoting the new observant branch of the Franciscan order, which emphasized stricter adherence to poverty and discipline. By bringing the observants to England and supporting their houses, Margaret helped renew the vitality of religious life in her kingdom. One of the most visible expressions of her devotion was her investment in chapels and churches. She was responsible for significant architectural contributions, including the restoration of Westminster Abbey's Lady Chapel and various parish churches. These were not mere displays of wealth. They were acts of faith. To Margaret, stone and mortar became a form of prayer, a way to glorify God and ensure that worship could flourish. Her projects were often meticulous, with statutes and endowments ensuring that services would be held, prayers recited, and masses sung in perpetuity for the souls of the faithful. Her personal discipline was legendary. Even as the mother of a king, she chose to live simply, adopting near monastic habits in her household. She wore plain clothing, abstained from indulgence, and kept a rigorous spiritual routine. Visitors to her household described an atmosphere more akin to a convent than a noble court, with daily prayers, devotions, and acts of charity woven into its rhythm. Margaret's religious convictions were not only private but also performative. She sought to model a life of humility and devotion for those around her, demonstrating that even in positions of power, one could embrace piety. John Fisher, who would later die a martyr under Henry VIII, was instrumental in shaping Margaret's religious identity. As her spiritual director, he encouraged her to see patronage as a form of service to God. Fisher himself was a learned man, and under his guidance, Margaret's religious patronage often intersected with her educational efforts. For example, she endowed sermons and theological lectures, blending her twin passions for faith and scholarship. This synergy between religion and learning would later define her enduring contributions to Cambridge University. That Margaret's devotion also had a personal, almost ascetic dimension. She made vows of chastity after her last marriage, dedicating herself fully to spiritual pursuits. Such a decision was rare for a noble woman of her stature, especially given the expectations of her station. Yet it reflected her conviction that her life should be wholly dedicated to God and to the service of others. By aligning her personal discipline with her public patronage, Margaret blurred the line between private piety and institutional religion. Beyond buildings and endowments, Margaret also invested in the spiritual nourishment of ordinary believers. She commissioned translations of devotional texts into English, ensuring that laypeople could access religious teachings in their own language. Her support for printing presses and the dissemination of religious works positioned her at the forefront of a cultural shift, the growing emphasis on vernacular spirituality. While the Reformation was still decades away, Margaret's patronage helped lay the groundwork for a more literate and engaged religious public. It is important to note that her religious zeal was not without its political dimension. In supporting the observant Franciscans, she also reinforced the moral authority of the Tudor regime. Her chapels and endowments linked the new dynasty with visible symbols of faith and continuity, reassuring a kingdom weary of dynastic strife. By presenting herself as a pious matriarch, she lent spiritual legitimacy to her son's reign, subtly intertwining religious devotion with political stability that, in retrospect, Margaret Beaufort's religious patronage reveals a woman who understood faith as both personal vocation and public responsibility. She believed that devotion demanded action, whether in building chapels, endowing prayers, or nurturing religious orders. Her efforts were not isolated acts of charity, but part of a coherent vision, a society rooted in faith, learning, and service. The legacy of this devotion is still visible today. Chapels she endowed remain sites of worship. Religious orders she supported continued to thrive for generations, and her reputation as a model of piety has endured. Yet perhaps her greatest religious contribution was not in stone or ritual, but in her conviction that faith could and should shape institutions. This conviction would carry over directly into her work with Cambridge, where her religious vision merged seamlessly with her commitment to education. If Margaret Beaufort's religious patronage established her as a devout servant of God, it was her commitment to education, particularly at Cambridge University, that secured her reputation as one of England's most transformative benefactors. In an age when universities were fragile institutions struggling for survival, Margaret's vision and resources not only preserved Cambridge, but elevated it into a center of learning that continues to shape the intellectual life of the nation. By the time Margaret turned her attention to Cambridge in the 1490s, the university was in a precarious state. Political instability, economic hardship, and fluctuating patronage had left many of its colleges underfunded and vulnerable. The broader context of European intellectual life was also shifting. The Renaissance had brought a renewed emphasis on humanist learning, while the late medieval church still sought to train clergy to serve in parishes and courts. For Cambridge to thrive, it needed patrons who understood the intertwined importance of faith and scholarship. Margaret Beaufort was uniquely suited to this task. Her initial involvement began with the endowment of professorships. At the urging of her spiritual advisor, John Fisher, she established two of the earliest endowed chairs in theology at either Oxford or Cambridge. These were the Lady Margaret Professorships of Divinity at both universities, positions designed to ensure that generations of scholars could teach and debate the central questions of Christian doctrine. The move was groundbreaking. Endowed professorships provided stability, allowing distinguished scholars to devote themselves to teaching and research without the constant anxiety of financial insecurity. By funding theology directly, Margaret ensured that the heart of the university's intellectual life remained aligned with the faith she cherished. But Margaret did not stop there. Her most enduring educational legacies were the foundations of Christ's College and St. John's College, Cambridge. Both institutions owed their existence, in whole or in part, to her vision. Christ's College, originally founded as God's House, was refounded by Margaret in 1505 under a new name and with new statutes. She poured resources into its buildings, secured endowments for its scholars, and restructured its administration to ensure long-term stability. Christ's College quickly became one of the leading colleges of Cambridge, producing generations of scholars, clergy, and statesmen. St. John's College was a more ambitious project, one that Margaret did not live to see completed. After her death in 1509, her executors, led by John Fisher, carried out her wishes to refound the college on the site of the dissolved Hospital of St. John. Margaret had laid the groundwork by securing royal permissions and drafting statutes. St. John's College was formally established in 1511, becoming one of the largest and most enduring colleges at Cambridge. Its foundation symbolized not only Margaret's commitment to education, but also her belief in the transformative power of institutions that combined faith, discipline, and scholarship. What distinguished Margaret's educational patronage was the coherence of her vision. She did not simply scatter funds or erect buildings for prestige. Instead, she wove her religious convictions into the very fabric of academic life. The statutes she established emphasized moral conduct, rigorous study, and spiritual discipline. Her colleges were not ivory towers divorced from the world. They were communities designed to nurture both intellect and character, producing graduates who would serve church and state with integrity. Her role in the development of Cambridge also underscores the agency she wielded in a society that often marginalized women. In an era when female patronage was typically confined to convents or chapels, Margaret's decision to invest in a university was bold. She asserted herself as a founder and lawgiver, leaving behind institutions that bore her name and her vision. Through education, she claimed a voice in the shaping of England's future. The impact of her patronage was immediate and long-lasting. Within decades, Cambridge emerged as a leading center of learning, attracting humanist scholars and producing figures who would shape the English Reformation and Renaissance. Both Christ's and St. John's colleges would later educate luminaries such as William Wilberforce, John Milton, and William Wordsworth. The ripple effects of Margaret's vision extended far beyond her lifetime, shaping not only academic life, but also the moral and cultural fabric of the nation. Her involvement with Cambridge also reflected her belief that education was inseparable from faith. She saw the cultivation of learning as an act of devotion, a means of glorifying God through the pursuit of truth. In this sense, her patronage was not merely charitable, but theological. By supporting scholars, she was investing in the intellectual defense of Christianity. This conviction gave her projects a depth and coherence that distinguished them from the more pragmatic or political benefactions of other nobles. Moreover, Margaret's contributions to Cambridge were intertwined with the Tudor dynasty's broader project of consolidation. By founding and endowing colleges, she bound the university to the new regime, ensuring that the intellectual elite of England would be shaped within institutions linked to Tudor patronage. This subtle but powerful act reinforced the legitimacy of her son's reign while embedding Tudor influence within the very structures of English learning. In retrospect, the birth of Margaret Beaufort's Cambridge legacy reveals a woman who understood education not as a luxury, but as a cornerstone of national life. She grasped that dynasties might rise and fall, but institutions of learning could endure, shaping minds and morals long after battles were forgotten. In securing professorships, founding colleges, and embedding faith within scholarship, she laid the foundations for a tradition of learning that continues to flourish. Margaret's work with Cambridge represents perhaps the most tangible expression of her belief that wealth and influence carried a sacred responsibility. By the end of her life, she had transformed a vulnerable institution into a beacon of learning, a legacy that has endured for more than 5 centuries. While Margaret Beaufort is often remembered for her role in stabilizing Cambridge through the foundation of Christ's and St. John's colleges, her influence also extended into the broader intellectual and cultural movement of her age, humanism. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were a time of transition, when a medieval scholastic tradition was gradually giving way to Renaissance humanism, a movement that emphasized classical learning, moral philosophy, and the study of languages. Margaret's educational vision was not isolated from these currents. On the contrary, she stood at the intersection of faith and humanist learning, supporting the cultural renewal that would soon reshape England. Humanism in England was still in its formative stages during Margaret's lifetime. While Italy had long been the epicenter of Renaissance learning, figures like Erasmus of Rotterdam were beginning to spread humanist ideals across Northern Europe. Cambridge and Oxford, though still dominated by scholastic methods, were becoming receptive to these new ideas. Margaret's patronage created the institutional framework that allowed humanism to take root. By funding professorships and endowing colleges, she provided spaces where scholars could engage with classical texts, develop linguistic skills, and integrate humanist methods into theological study. Central to this development was her close relationship with John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. Fisher himself was a product of Cambridge and an early advocate of humanist learning. He encouraged the study of Greek and Hebrew, believing that a deeper engagement with Scripture required knowledge of its original languages. Under his influence, Margaret's patronage embraced the humanist spirit of returning to the sources, ad fontes, both in classical literature and in Christian Scripture. This emphasis would profoundly shape the intellectual direction of Cambridge in the decades to come. Margaret's commitment to vernacular spirituality also aligned with humanist ideals. She commissioned translations of devotional texts into English, believing that ordinary believers should have access to religious writings in their own tongue. This was not a radical departure from orthodoxy, but it reflected a broader cultural shift toward accessibility and literacy. By supporting the dissemination of texts, Margaret anticipated some of the concerns that would later fuel the Reformation. The idea that Scripture and devotion should not be confined to the learned elite. Her household itself became a microcosm of humanist influence. She surrounded herself with clerics and scholars, including not only Fisher, but also tutors and translators who worked on religious and classical texts. Visitors described a household disciplined by prayer and study, where intellectual inquiry coexisted with rigorous devotion. In this way, Margaret embodied the fusion of medieval piety and Renaissance learning, modeling a life in which scholarship served faith. Her patronage also extended into the material culture of the period. By commissioning books, sponsoring translations, and supporting the early use of printing presses, she participated in the cultural revolution of her age. The printing press had only recently been introduced to England in the late 15th century, but Margaret quickly recognized its potential. She supported the production of religious works, ensuring that prayers, meditations, and devotional texts could reach a wider audience. This embrace of new technology underscores her foresight and her desire to align faith with cultural innovation. Point 1. Cannot underestimate the cultural significance of the colleges she endowed. Christ's and St. John's colleges were not simply training grounds for clergy. They became centers where humanist scholarship flourished. Within a generation, these institutions would nurture figures like Thomas Cranmer and Hugh Latimer, who played central roles in the English Reformation. While Margaret herself remained firmly orthodox, her patronage helped create the conditions in which new intellectual currents could take root. In this sense, her legacy straddles two worlds: the medieval devotion of her own life and the Renaissance humanism that her institutions fostered. The cultural impact of her work is also evident in the moral and ethical emphasis she placed on education. Humanism was not merely about the recovery of classical texts. It was about shaping virtuous individuals who could serve society. Margaret's statutes for her colleges emphasized discipline, moral integrity, and service to the church. In doing so, she aligned her vision with the humanist ideal of the well-rounded, morally grounded scholar. Her colleges were designed not only to cultivate intellect, but also to form character. Moreover, Margaret's influence extended beyond Cambridge. Through her endowments and her model of pious patronage, she inspired other noble patrons to support learning and culture. The Tudor court, under her son Henry VII and later her grandson Henry VIII, became increasingly receptive to humanist scholars. Figures like Erasmus would soon find patrons and audiences in England, laying the groundwork for the flourishing of English Renaissance literature and thought. Margaret, though she did not live to see this full flowering, had prepared the soil. Her embrace of humanist ideals also reflects her unique ability to adapt. She was a woman rooted in medieval traditions of devotion, yet she recognized the value of new currents of thought. She did not see faith and humanism as opposites, but as complementary pursuits. In her vision, Classical learning could strengthen theological understanding, and new cultural tools like the printing press could deepen spiritual devotion. This integrative approach distinguished her from contemporaries who resisted change, making her a bridge between two eras that I in the broader sweep of history. Margaret Beaufort's cultural influence demonstrates how individual patronage could shape the trajectory of a nation's intellectual life. She did not write treatises or lead armies, but through her vision, resources, and networks, she created conditions in which faith and humanism could coexist and thrive. Her legacy is not only the colleges that still stand at Cambridge, but also the intellectual tradition they helped foster, one that blended devotion with inquiry, tradition with innovation. Among Margaret Beaufort's many achievements, the foundation of St. John's College, Cambridge, stands as one of the clearest testaments to her enduring vision. While Christ's College had already demonstrated her capacity to strengthen an existing institution, St. John's was a more ambitious endeavor, an act of renewal that transformed a medieval religious hospital into one of the great colleges of England. Though Margaret did not live to see its completion, the college remains a living monument to her foresight and faith. The story of St. John's College begins with the Hospital of St. John, a medieval foundation established in the 12th century to care for the poor and sick. By the late 15th century, the hospital had fallen into decline, its resources depleted, and its spiritual mission weakened. Margaret recognized both the symbolic and practical potential of this site. By converting a failing religious institution into a thriving college, she could preserve the spiritual heritage of the past while reshaping it for the needs of the future. It was an act of both continuity and transformation. Margaret's involvement with St. John's began in her final years. Encouraged by her spiritual director, John Fisher, she set her sights on endowing a new college that would carry forward her educational and religious mission. She secured royal licenses from her son, Henry VII, allowing her to acquire the site and redirect its resources. This was no small feat. In a period when land and institutions were jealously guarded, Margaret's ability to marshal authority and navigate legal complexities reflected both her influence and her determination. Her vision for St. John's was ambitious. The statutes she drafted emphasized the integration of faith and learning, calling for the college to educate not only clergy, but also scholars who could serve the broader needs of the church and the realm. Like her earlier work with Christ's College, Margaret's design for St. John's emphasized discipline, moral conduct, and devotion. Students were to live communally, adhering to rules that reflected both scholastic rigor and spiritual commitment. Yet Margaret did not live to see her project realized. She died in June 1509, just months after the death of her son Henry VII, and only days after the coronation of her grandson, Henry VIII. At her passing, the plans for St. John's were incomplete, but Margaret had chosen her executors wisely. Chief among them was John Fisher, who took up the mantle of her vision with unwavering dedication. Fisher, himself a Cambridge man, ensured that Margaret's intentions were honored in full. Under his guidance, the hospital was dissolved and its assets redirected to the establishment of the new college. In 1511, just 2 years after Margaret's death, St. John's College was formally founded. Its creation marked not only the fulfillment of Margaret's wishes, but also the beginning of a new chapter in Cambridge's history. St. John's quickly grew into one of the largest and most prestigious colleges of the university, its size and resources reflecting the scale of Margaret's ambition. Its architectural grandeur and intellectual vitality set it apart as a beacon of learning and devotion. The significance of St. John's lies not only in its scale, but also in its symbolism. By transforming a medieval hospital into a modern college, Margaret and her executors demonstrated the adaptability of religious patronage in a changing age. The hospital had cared for the body. The college would now care for the mind and soul. In this transformation, we see Margaret's conviction that education was itself a form of charity, a gift that could heal society by cultivating wisdom and virtue. Over the centuries, St. John's College became home to some of the greatest minds of England. Its alumni include poets, philosophers, politicians, and reformers whose influence has echoed across the centuries. Figures such as William Wilberforce, who led the campaign to abolish the slave trade, and Thomas Clarkson, his ally in the same cause, studied within its walls. In this sense, Margaret's vision bore fruit far beyond her lifetime, contributing to moral and social movements that reshaped the modern world. What makes St. John's particularly significant in Margaret's legacy is its embodiment of her dual commitment to faith and education. Unlike purely secular institutions, St. John's was rooted in the rhythms of devotion. Its statutes required daily prayer, theological study, and moral discipline. It was also a place of rigorous scholarship, open to the currents of humanism and the intellectual innovations of the Renaissance. This dual identity made it uniquely suited to shape generations of leaders who could navigate both church and state. That Margaret's foundation of St. John's also underscores her capacity to think beyond her own lifetime. She knew that she would not see the college completed, but she ensured that her executors had both the authority and the resources to carry it forward. In this, she demonstrated the foresight of a true visionary. Her legacy was not a fleeting monument to personal glory, but a durable institution designed to serve the common good for centuries. In reflecting on St. John's, we see the culmination of Margaret's life's work. From her early struggles as a widowed mother through the perils of dynastic war, to her ascension as the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, she had always been guided by a sense of purpose rooted in faith and service. St. John's College was the fullest expression of that purpose, a place where learning and devotion could flourish together, shaping minds and souls for generations. Today, as one walks through the courts and chapels of St. John's, Margaret's vision still resonates. The college remains one of Cambridge's most vibrant institutions, its traditions and scholarship continuing to reflect the ideals she cherished. It stands as a reminder that true legacy is not measured by titles or battles won, but by institutions built to nurture the future. Margaret Beaufort's legacy cannot be confined to her educational and religious patronage alone. While Christ's and St. John's colleges remain the most tangible symbols of her vision, her influence stretched far beyond the walls of Cambridge. As the mother of Henry VII and grandmother of Henry VIII, she played a crucial role in shaping the Tudor dynasty, which would dominate England for over a century. Her guidance, example, and political acumen laid the groundwork not only for educational reform, but also for the stability and transformation of England itself. From the moment she secured the throne for her son Henry VII in 1485, Margaret positioned herself as more than a dowager mother. She styled herself as the My Lady the King's Mother, a unique title that reflected her authority without overstepping into sovereign power. This balance of influence was critical. At a time when women were rarely allowed a voice in politics, Margaret's careful navigation of court life allowed her to wield extraordinary influence without provoking backlash. Her political role was quiet but decisive, shaping the early Tudor court into a space where stability, piety, and learning could flourish. One of her most enduring contributions to the dynasty was the ethos she instilled in Henry VII. Though he was a cautious and pragmatic king, Henry shared his mother's appreciation for learning, order, and piety. Together, they cultivated an image of the monarchy that emphasized moral integrity and legitimacy, a stark contrast to the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. In this sense, Margaret's moral and religious convictions helped define the cultural tone of the early Tudor monarchy. Her influence continued into the reign of her grandson, Henry VIII. Although Margaret died in 1509, just after Henry VIII's coronation, the institutions and values she had established remained deeply embedded in the Tudor court. Henry VIII himself benefited directly from her educational patronage, as the colleges she endowed produced many of the scholars and clerics who would serve in his reign. Ironically, while Margaret had been a staunch defender of orthodoxy, her educational vision fostered the intellectual environment that made the English Reformation possible. Figures educated at Cambridge, many of them products of her foundations, would become the architects of religious change under Henry VIII and beyond. In this sense, Margaret's influence extended indirectly into the most dramatic transformation of English religious life, the break with Rome. While she would have opposed such a rupture, the seeds of reform were planted in the soil she had tilled. By promoting the study of Scripture in its original languages, supporting humanist scholarship, and fostering a culture of intellectual inquiry, she inadvertently helped prepare a generation of reformers. Her colleges became breeding grounds for debate, producing thinkers who challenged traditional authority in ways she could not have anticipated. Beyond religion, Margaret's dynastic legacy was profound. The Tudor line she secured not only stabilized England after decades of civil war, but also presided over one of the most remarkable cultural flowerings in English history. From Henry VIII's assertive monarchy to Elizabeth I's golden age, the dynasty Margaret midwifed reshaped England's political, religious, and cultural identity. Her role in securing this dynasty cannot be overstated. Without her persistence, faith, and political maneuvering, the Tudors might never have risen to power. Margaret's personal example also left its mark. Her life story, marked by resilience, discipline, and devotion, became a model of Tudor virtue. She embodied the values of loyalty, piety, and charity, values that the dynasty sought to project. Her careful management of estates, her strategic marriages, and her patronage of both religious and educational institutions showcased the potential of noble women to influence public life. In this way, Margaret helped expand the cultural imagination of what women could achieve in a male-dominated society. Her influence even touched law and governance. Margaret's careful drafting of statutes for her colleges reflected a keen understanding of institutional design and attention to rules and order that paralleled the legal reforms pursued by her son. This shared emphasis on order and continuity contributed to the perception of the Tudors as builders of stability, in contrast to the chaos of the preceding century. At the same time, Margaret's legacy carried tensions that would play out in Tudor England. Her commitment to orthodoxy sat uneasily with the reformist currents her institutions helped unleash. Her devotion to monastic style discipline foreshadowed institutions that would later be dissolved under her grandson. Her reverence for Catholic ritual stood at odds with the Protestant identity that emerged under later Tudors. Yet it is precisely in these tensions that we see the complexity of her influence. She was both a preserver of the old and a catalyst for the new, in the broader scope of English history. Margaret Beaufort stands as a figure whose impact transcended her own era. She was not a monarch, yet she shaped the monarchy. She did not write theological treatises, yet her patronage redirected the course of English religion. She was not a scholar, yet her endowments transformed English education. Her influence worked through others, through her son, her grandson, her protégés, and the countless students who passed through her colleges. But it was nonetheless decisive by the time of her death. Margaret had secured a dynasty, reformed institutions, and planted seeds of cultural renewal. She had achieved a rare kind of immortality, not only through bloodline and succession, but through ideas, institutions, and values that continued to bear fruit long after she was gone. Her life reminds us that legacy is not always about immediate glory. Sometimes it is about laying foundations that others will build upon, trusting that the future will vindicate the labor of faith and foresight. Margaret Beaufort's life and work form a narrative arc that stretches from the turbulence of the Wars of the Roses to the cultural flowering of Tudor England. She was born into instability, endured personal loss and political danger, and yet emerged as one of the most consequential figures of her age. Her enduring legacy, however, is not found in the fleeting victories of dynastic struggle, but in the institutions she shaped, the values she championed, and the intellectual foundations she laid for future generations. At Cambridge, her vision crystallized into two enduring monuments, Christ College and St. John's College. Together, they embodied her belief in the transformative power of education. Christ represented renewal, the revitalization of an existing institution, St. John's embodied creation, the transformation of a medieval hospital into a beacon of learning. Both carried her signature blend of faith and scholarship, discipline and devotion. In their statutes, buildings, and traditions, one can still glimpse the imprint of her character, rigorous, pious, and purposeful. But her legacy was never limited to Cambridge. By endowing professorships, supporting translations, and embracing the possibilities of printing, Margaret contributed to the broader cultural and intellectual currents of her time. Her alignment with humanist ideals, guided by her trusted advisor John Fisher, ensured that the institutions she founded were not relics of medieval scholasticism, but active participants in the dawn of Renaissance learning. She bridged the old and the new, ensuring that her colleges could adapt to an era of change. Her religious devotion also left a mark on England's spiritual life. Though she remained firmly orthodox, her support for vernacular spirituality, accessible devotion, and the study of Scripture in its original languages anticipated concerns that would later animate the Reformation. In this way, Margaret's piety, though rooted in tradition, contained within its seeds of transformation. She sought not to dismantle the Church, but to strengthen it through learning, accessibility, and reform from within. Margaret's influence on the Tudor dynasty likewise endures. Without her determination, her son Henry VII might never have claimed the throne. Without her careful stewardship, the early Tudor monarchy might not have projected the stability and legitimacy that it did. And without her foresight, the dynasty might not have been so deeply intertwined with education, faith, and culture. Through her, the Tudors inherited not just a crown, but a mission to cultivate learning and moral order. Her story is also a testament to the power of women in history. Though constrained by the structures of her time, Margaret carved out a space of influence through faith, intellect, and strategic vision. She demonstrated that patronage, discipline, and moral authority could shape a nation as decisively as swords and crowns. In doing so, she expanded the horizons of what was possible for women of her station, leaving behind a model of piety joined with power, humility joined with ambition. Today, her legacy continues to resonate. Christ's and St. John's colleges remain among Cambridge's most vibrant institutions, their students and scholars heirs to her vision of learning as a sacred trust. The Chapel of St. John's, the Courts of Christ's, the very stones of Cambridge speak of her enduring presence. Beyond Cambridge, the very idea of education as a cornerstone of national renewal, a belief that has shaped English identity for centuries, owes something to her example. Yet her legacy is not static. Like all great figures, Margaret Beaufort invites reinterpretation in each age. Some view her as a saintly matriarch, others as a shrewd political strategist. Some emphasize her orthodoxy, others her role in enabling reform. This multiplicity reflects the richness of her life and the breadth of her impact. She was at once medieval and modern, traditional and transformative, devout and pragmatic. In the final reckoning, Margaret Beaufort's life offers a lesson in the enduring power of vision. She did not live to see the full flowering of her work. Christ's and St. John's would grow beyond her imagination. The Tudor dynasty would transform England in ways she could not foresee, and the intellectual currents she supported would reshape the world. But she planted seeds in faith, trusting that others would tend them. And those seeds bore fruit in abundance. Her legacy is therefore both a personal triumph and a collective inheritance. It belongs to Cambridge, to the Tudor dynasty, to England, and to the countless students, scholars, and believers who continue to be shaped by the institutions she founded. It is a legacy of education, faith, resilience, and vision, a reminder that true greatness often lies not in domination, but in creation, not in conquest, but in cultivation. As one reflects on her story, a final question lingers. If Margaret Beaufort could achieve so much amid the constraints and uncertainties of her time, what might we achieve in ours if guided by the same devotion, foresight, and commitment to the future? The answer lies not in history's silence, but in the living traditions she left behind, still shaping minds and spirits more than 5 centuries later.